Today is day 4,911, and it is Jonathan Ames Day here at Boswell. Ames is, of course, author of Wake Up, Sir! I Love You More Than You Know, You Were Never Really Here, and other books, novels, and collections of essays. He's the creator of TV shows Bored to Death and Blunt Talk, and he is here to talk about the second installment of his Happy Doll series, The Wheel of Doll. I absolutely love these books. Reading these books has been a return to why I fell in love with crime fiction and fell in love with old school Los Angeles noir. So I can't wait to hear Jonathan read and to chat with him about this book. Jonathan, welcome. Little switch.
Okay, thank you for having me. It's very, I've never been to Milwaukee before, and I was at a mystery convention in Minneapolis, and I had done a virtual event at this store about a year ago for the first doll book, and I was so impressed by the pictures of the store. I love bookstores, and so I asked, well, I'm in the Midwest, could I come here? And I didn't fully think about that there was a 4.5-hour drive anyway, but it was a lovely drive through farmland, and then getting a glimpse of the lake just now was so magnificent. So what a beautiful city. I have never been here before. Anyway, so thank you. I'm going to read a couple of quick passages, and hopefully it won't take too long, but to give you a flavor of the book, and then we'll do the Q&A.
Great.
Yeah, I'll just start at the beginning, but I think it's fairly obvious. It's a first-person narration by a detective named Happy Doll. His parents saddled him with that, but they didn't realize it might be difficult. Anyway, off we go. One of my flaws is that I'm a great one for asking questions, but I'm mediocre to poor at answers, which isn't the best trait for a detective, though it may be why of late I've become an armchair Buddhist. In Buddhism, you're meant to question everything, including the idea of questioning everything. And really, there are no answers anyway, but that's in nirvana, which is where you get to go to when you become enlightened. I hear it's very peaceful there. But in this messy realm, the realm of women and men and all their myriad problems, there are some answers to some questions. You can figure some things out, which is why you need detectives, even mediocre to poor ones like me. Because finding a killer can be like finding an answer, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The afternoon when all this began, it seemed like just another nice cold Los Angeles day, and by cold I mean 65 degrees, early in 2020. January 10th, 2020, to be exact, a Friday. It was around 4:40 and I had just left my house and gotten into my car, a 1985 Royal Blue Chevy Caprice Classic, once the preferred vehicle for police forces in the 20th century, which was a long time ago now, and not just in years. I started the Caprice and let it warm up a second, since it's an old car like an old man, and always needs a moment to gather itself and get its pants on. But despite its age and 300,000 miles, it's not ready to die. Very few of us are. To pass the time, I lit a joint. Then I took a sip of coffee from my thermos. I'm one of those people, maybe the only one, that lives on coffee and pot and small fish, pickled herring, sardines, and kippers. As I took a second sip, I put the radio on, which was already tuned to 88.9, a strange college station, my favorite. And then I took another hit of my joint and another sip of my coffee, and feeling that wonderful alchemy of the cannabis and the caffeine, you're ready to go somewhere, but don't care too much if you make it. I backed out of the garage and rolled down my dead-end street, Glen Alder. I was on my way to my office to meet a potential new client. We had a 5:30 appointment, and I needed the business. From Glen Alder, I turned right onto Beechwood, and a black Challenger with tinted windows parked on the corner swung in behind me, reckless-like and urgent, and I felt a small tingle of alarm. Since marijuana doesn't make me paranoid, except when I eat it, I had to assume that the tingle was coming, like a pre-conscious telegram, from that special part of the brain that knows things before it knows things. But that part of the brain doesn't use words. It uses feelings, like foreboding and fear. Anyway, he does get followed. I'll skip that part. And now I'll go to the moment when he's in his office and he meets his client. I turned on the desk lamp, which gave the office a nice glow, and the door opened slowly. Then she teetered in, a little wobbly, on large blocky heels, and gave me a shy smile. Tall and willowy, strange and beautiful, she came through that door like someone coming in from another time. In her right hand was a small vintage purse, maybe big enough for a wallet or a small gun. Miss D'Angelo? Yes, she said, and then she looked away. The pink worm on my face often caused that reaction. I forgot to mention from the first book, Happy has a noticeable scar on the side of his face that he refers to as like looking like a pink worm. Come in, I said cheerily. She closed the door behind her. I'm sorry I'm early. Not a problem, I said, and she wobbled on those big heels toward me. She was wearing a black cotton dress with some kind of lacy frill at the top. It had a vintage shop look, and draped around her shoulders was an old brown men's cardigan, overly big. She was young, somewhere in her early 20s, and her hair was cut short with a bang of sleek black curls arranged on her forehead like a line of musical notes. And I noticed as she got closer that her left eye, an eerie pale green, was off center and seemed to be staring at the photos on the wall. And the right eye, equally pale green and equally eerie, bore down on me cyclopically. The off-kilter eye flawed her beauty, making it even greater. And she had an elegant long nose and a full mouth painted a violet red, and there were no wrinkles in her bluish white, almost translucent skin. She looked like a flapper, and I stepped around my desk and offered my hand. Her cold hand went in mine, and her long fingernails were painted carmine or dipped in blood, and the bones of her fingers felt like the spines of bird feathers. So nice to meet you, I said, and I could smell her perfume, sandalwood. And I flashed painfully for a moment to a woman I had loved, and there was a fragmentary vision of the beloved rushing out of a shop to greet me, and then I returned to the present. Nice to meet you, the young woman said, looking at me with her one eye, and the effect was compelling. It made the way she looked at you more intense, more intimate than maybe it was. Then I released her hand. Please sit down, I said, and I pulled on the back of the client chair, making a little space for her like a waiter in a French movie, or a French restaurant for that matter. She sat down, and then I sat down across from her. Between us was my old gray metal desk, which in its youth worked for the post office on North Alvarado. I had bought it at auction for $5, and I could sometimes feel the ghosts of the postal workers who had sat behind it for decades, their lives ticking by like all lives, clocks meant to run down. On top of the desk were 3 items of interest: a stone paperweight with a painting of my dog George on it, a coffee mug with a photograph of my dog George on it, and a 1950 sculpted coffee mug of Lou Costello's face, which I use for pens and other office detritus. Traffic all right, I said to kick things off. Fine, she said. Where were you coming from? West Hollywood. Oh, I'm glad it wasn't too bad. I took an Uber, just looked out the window, she said. Then she gave me a sad, melancholic smile. A life weariness came over her, and that exhausted the preliminaries, and we lapsed into silence. Well, I think just you didn't. I'll skip ahead to these 2 passages about George. But she asks about George. I'll just read that part. She notices the cup, and then she says, while I did this, she waved her hand at the George mug and the George stone and said, "Who's that?" I turned the mug with the George photo toward her so that she could get the full effect of his liquid eyes. "That's my dog George," I said. "We're very close." "He's beautiful," she said. "I won't disagree with you," I said. In the picture, George, who is half Chihuahua, half terrier, is looking over his shoulder at me with a lot of feeling. "He has dreamy eyes like the girl with the pearl earring by Vermeer," she said, sounding quite Ivy League and affected. The cadence of her speech was sophisticated, practiced, and made her sound older than she was. "That's a painting?" I asked. "Oh, yes," she said. "Very famous for the eyes, for beautiful eyes." Okay, and now just 2 more passages, and we'll get to meet the dog. Okay.
You can't get enough George in this book.
Yeah, and I imagine there's dog lovers, and dog lovers backward is Srival, God. And I can speak backwards when not nervous, like nervous is Suavren, backwards is Sadrawkakab. Microphone is Inachba Orkim. Chris Lee is Eel Cirque. Okay, enough of that. Okay. All right, I stopped at the Gelson's Market on Franklin and picked up a grass-fed New York strip for $17 and change. Even having tossed the bartender 100 to clean up my karma, I was feeling flush, and I hadn't had meat in a while, not since the money got tight. In addition to the steak, I picked up a baguette, and from Gelson's, I returned home to Glen Alder Street and parked in my standalone street-level garage. My house, which is on the hill above the garage, is an old crumbling Spanish bungalow that was willed to me years ago by an elderly client after she passed. To get to the house from the street, you have to climb 12 stairs, then pass through a wooden gate and fence and climb 33 more stairs, the equivalent overall of about 2 stories. My front yard, which the stairs run alongside, is an overgrown slope of wildflowers and weeds and bougainvillea, as well as several trees which shroud the house in privacy. And that night, as I climbed the dark stairs through my little patch of forest, I felt very French. My baguette was in my hand like a sword, and when I came through the front door, George jumped on me frantically, beside himself with joy, and I swatted him lovingly on his meager buttocks with the bread like I was a fencing master and said, "Down, young man." And then he attacked one of his toys, pretending to kill it as a way to work through his good feelings. While he did this, I unwrapped the steak and left it out on the kitchen counter to get it to room temperature. Then I took George for a walk, and back down the stairs we went. When we hit the street, I delighted, as I often do, in the way he trotted along on his thin white legs. There's an inherent optimism to his canter and a strength of spirit that I very much admire, which I can't quite pull off myself, but at least I can see it in him. After a block of quick trotting, he then began his usual dedicated hunt for the urine markings of fellow dogs, which he then covered over with his mark. And of course, a lot of times when he lifted his leg, nothing visible to the human eye came out. But I always imagine in these instances that some hormonal spray signature is released, and I try my best never to rush him when he's smelling urine and marking, as I know it's all very important to him, his life's work more or less, and so I use the time to study him like a lover. His torso is golden tan and sleek, his neck is white like the collar of a formal shirt, and his head is brown with ears as soft as French velvet. And his eyes, as Mary D'Angelo had pointed out, are his most distinctive feature, large and amber-colored, full of love and sadness, like all the great poets, and they're rimmed with black, as if by a mascara's wand. And I'll just skip ahead and just read one more section about George. Okay. An hour later, this later in the evening, or 2 nights later, an hour later, George and I were in bed, and I was reading Watership Down, and George on top of the covers by my thigh was having a dream, vocalizing little yips. He has a rich inner life and may have been dreaming about his nemesis across the street, a proud German shepherd with failing hips named Major. Meanwhile, I had eaten a cannabis edible before brushing my teeth to help me sleep when I stopped reading, and I was feeling some far-off paranoia, the usual sense of approaching doom and punishment, but it wasn't too bad. Then, my eyes growing tired, I read this passage in my book. Rabbits, say Mr. Lockley, are like human beings in many ways. One of these is certainly their staunch ability to withstand disaster and to let the stream of their life carry them along past reaches of terror and loss. They have a certain quality which it would not be accurate to describe as callousness or indifference. It is rather a blessedly circumscribed imagination, an intuitive feeling that life is now. I nodded in firm agreement with this, thinking that rabbits were quite wise and that this was an excellent approach to life, something for me to aspire to. And it occurred to me that the rabbits were in their own way very Buddhist, since the Buddha preached the utter importance of the now, as did all the Eastern philosophies. Then, too tired to keep reading, I rested the book on my chest and placed my hand lightly on George's tawny back. He had stopped yipping and was now sleeping peacefully. I hadn't intended to disturb him, but the slight pressure of my hand woke him, and he looked at me tenderly and drowsily and seemed to be saying telepathically, "Don't you think it's time to go to bed?" So I looked at my watch. It was almost 12:30, and he was right. Time for bed. I turned off the light, and George got under the blankets. He nestled against my right thigh, a good warm spot, my dear pal. A silvery light from the moon slipped in around the edges of the curtains, and with thoughts of Ines and Mary and the grotesque marrow swimming around in my mind, I lay there unable to sleep. I had too many questions. Who were those 4 young men doing drugs, and why were they in the house? And where did Hayes Langdon come in, and who exactly was Marrow? And as the minutes passed, the edible became more and more amplified in my mind and my body, and I could feel George quite viscerally against my leg, and it seemed like I was having some new level of connection to him, like we were piled up as puppies in a litter together, or rabbits in a burrow, and I had a flash of insight, some kind of understanding why animals sleep so close together, because it felt like George and I were one large fused animal, and what I was experiencing was Darwinian safety in numbers, like a school of fish swimming together to appear like a large fish. And I was feeling it, really feeling it. And because of this fusing, I began to sense what it was like to be George, to be in his body, to be quick and fast, compact and springy. And he could feel what it was like to be me, ponderous yet strong. And our minds were operating along one pathway, exchanging information, inner blueprints. And I thought, how could I have never experienced this before? And it was magnificent. I had always wanted to be a dog, or at least part dog. But then, because one is never allowed to stay in heaven for too long, my cell phone rang like a fire alarm, tragically breaking the spell. And I cursed the bastard phone. I wanted to be half George again, but it was useless. The moment had passed, maybe never to be felt again. And I reached for the glowing instrument on my bedside table, and there was no name on the screen, only a number. But I pushed answer, and it felt strange to speak English after having merged with George, but I managed to spit out, "Hello?" It was Mary, and her voice was very faint. "I just wanted to thank you again for doing this, Mr. Dahl, and also that I'm very sorry about my husband, that he was rude to you. You don't have to apologize, but I wanted to. I understand. Are you all right, Mary?" "I'm fine. Good night, Mr. Dahl." And she abruptly hung up. Like everything to do with this case, her call was strange and disconcerting, and I thought of calling her back, but I didn't, and I put the phone down on the table. Then I closed my eyes and thought about the trip ahead and wondered if I might really find Ines and what that would be like. And George was still warm against my leg, peacefully oblivious to my problems, and I dreaded parting from him the next day. So that's all I'll read.
Yeah, that's lovely, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for reading. I think to start, this certainly begs the question: are you a dog person?
I am a dog person. I have a dog named Fezzik. I didn't name him. But that name is from the film of Princess Bride. The Andre the Giant character was named Fezzik. And I didn't, yeah, he was a rescue. But anyway, it was more or less love at first sight. I fostered him. And then within 24 hours, I said, "Can I keep him?" And luckily they said yes. I was an in-between foster person or something. And yeah, I've been with this wonderful dog 5 years now. And yeah, I'm a dog person. I had a cat in my life once. I was driving a cab. This was years ago, and I saw this little kitten in the middle of the street. Turned out he was lost, and so I was with him for a while.
Then he was found.
Yes, and but then I had to move and give him up. But yeah, so I love both dogs and cats. I think most people could be that way. That's what Jung said, right? I mean,
Exactly. I think that's exactly how he put it.
yeah.
George, let's talk about George the dog. I have my George the dog. I love him. And I love him in the book because he's this bright spot in Happy Doll's life, and it is not a happy life in general. And it really adds a tenderness to the books. I mean, I think the passage you just read, we all heard that. But at the same time, for me, it raises the stakes of the books because every time Happy is barreling into a situation, every time he's in over his head in danger, which he is quite often in both of these books, particularly the new one, I'm thinking, how's he going to get out of this? What's going to happen? But also in the back of my head, I'm like, who's going to feed George if this goes wrong? Did you feel that pressure?
Oh yeah, well, I always make sure to, of course, George, when Happy leaves town, he leaves him with a friend, and George is always very much on his mind. And then a little bit like in the Perils of Pauline thing, I mean, George does get put in danger, unfortunately, every book. But yeah, I don't, it's Donald Westlake, the wonderful mystery writer. Those of you familiar with him, and he also wrote under the pseudonym Richard Stark. And I read some interview with him in which he was talking about his great crime series about Parker. If you haven't read the Parker series of crime novels by Richard Stark, I highly recommend them. And it's good to start at the beginning with the first one, which I believe is called The Hunter. And there's 24 of them. They're wonderful crime novels written with the precision of like a Dashiell Hammett, like chiseled, beautiful writing. And anyway, I saw this interview where he was talking about this criminal Parker that he wrote a lot about. And he said, I made him completely hard and cold, didn't give him a dog, and it didn't saw. And I was like, oh man, that's a weakness. I gave my guy a dog, but because Westlake is like my god and or my dog and backwards. And but yeah, I gave him a dog, but I guess it's a chance for me to, my girlfriend says that my dog is my muse, and she sort of says that like there is a, when people are sarcastic, there's a hint of truth, or what I mean. I think it does upset her sometimes, even though she's overly, to use a Freudian term, cathected to her dog as well. But she's always accusing me of being too close to my dog, which, I'm like, what about you and your dog? I mean, you guys are very close. Anyway, so he does have this relationship, which does soften him. And in many ways, those of you who haven't read these books or aren't familiar with them, I may have given a slight misimpression because I write the dog passages almost in a different voice, because almost a different voice of Happy emerges. But much of the book is Happy in extremis and in danger. But the dog does give a chance for this other voice to emerge.
I think Happy has a few voices. And he definitely, I think in the second book, we see quite the transition through him, through the substances he's using to literally stay on his feet throughout the book. Early in the book, though, and you read the first passage where he's kind of contemplating Buddhism as he's on his way to leave the house. I love how you open the book talking about questions and finding answers, and his practice, his Buddhist practice, kind of pushing against even the concept of an answer, where at the same time, he may not be very good at it, but his job is to find answers, particularly answers that people may not want. People may not like that answer. Can you talk about that intersection between, for him, of kind of, I don't know what to call it, Buddhism and detectivism? I don't know what else to call it.
That's a good one. Well, yeah, the character, there was a lot of trauma in the first book, and it was always a dream of mine to write a series with a private detective. And then finally, now, after being a writer, my first book was published in 1989. So 33 years later, I started finally writing a detective series. And anyway, in the first book, the character Happy goes through a lot, and a lot of terrible things happen. And for the first time in his life, unfortunately, he kills more than one human being to get himself out of the scrape and save his friends and all that. And so in the second book, this is weighing on him tremendously. And so he begins to read Buddhist philosophy as a way to deal with his guilt and his self-hate over this. He's also, for years, as an ex-cop who is traumatized, been doing free psychoanalysis through an institute as a way to deal with what he went through as a policeman. So in this book, he's begun, as he says in the beginning, just the bare minimum of reading Buddhist philosophies as a way to, well, he doesn't quote this. So I'm at one point I meant to, but there's like some translation, or, some Buddhists might say that the Buddha said, I teach only suffering and the transformation of suffering. So it's a way to try to take your suffering, gain in compassion, empathy for yourself, for others, and to make the most of being alive right now while being of service to others. So Happy begins to study Buddhism in this book, but he's barely begun his study. He doesn't fully grasp the concepts, but he's trying to. And that's why the book is called The Wheel of Dal, because and there's a couple of reasons, but I don't think I'm giving anything explaining the title, but supposedly one in Buddhist philosophy, they say that the Buddha turned the Dharma wheel 12 times. And the Dharma is the path, the truth, which is basically that you can transform your suffering and suffer less and be of greater service to others. That's the Dharma. And so the wheel of Dal, so you might say the wheel of Dharma, but the wheel of Dal is a very confused, screwed up wheel, not quite the Dharma wheel. And so that's why it's called the Wheel of Dal. Like if he's some ways misapplying some of his Buddhism, and then at a certain point when things go crazy, he just has to give it up altogether, unfortunately. And then there's also the Wheel of Justice, and I just like the idea of the circularity of life. So anyway, that's some of the stuff about Buddhism.
Absolutely. And you mentioned it too. This book takes Happy to some very real dark places. And I think this book gets a lot darker and the first book's dark in a lot of ways. There may or may not be black market organ theft going on, human organs, not pipe organs. Anyway, particularly as he's dealing with the past, though. And it's interesting what you were saying about how the trauma is kind of now manifesting. He's now starting to work through that in this book. And I think in this book, as he's dealing with his past, but also as he's moving forward, you take him to some very, very dark places. Was that intentional? Were you trying to push further into dark spaces in this book, or did it happen naturally?
Yeah, I don't think I was intentionally trying to go darker, but I think there's a couple of things I am trying to do in these books, which is to write a page turner. I love the chemical effect as a reader when I read a page turner. When it's like 2:00 in the morning, I'm like, I know I should close this book, but I can't. And I love that feeling, whatever chemicals are being released by the page turner, the thriller. So that's one of my goals in writing these books, is to create that for the reader, because I so enjoy that experience myself. And so part of what creates a page turner perhaps is the catharsis we're experiencing of like, oh my God, this guy's in trouble. Is he going to get out of it? And it's sort of like a mirror, I would say, not a funhouse mirror, but a mirror for our own anxieties, our own fear. Like, even if we got pretty good lives or here at a nice bookstore, like I know all of us have so many anxieties that we try to manage. And a lot of times we feel completely overwhelmed. And so a detective novel is like Happy, I use this word extremist. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but he's like in these wildly anxious, frightening things, almost like probably like our nightmares. If those of you who have nightmares where a lot of times might have nightmares where I'm in a city and there's danger or war, or I'm being pursued, or I can't get to a phone, or I get to a phone. And a lot of times in my nightmares, like phones don't work. So literally I can't call for help, or I can't communicate. So I think the whole thing is some kind of, for me, expression of some profound anxiety that comes with life, which again is part of like maybe learning about Buddhist philosophy, to try to deal with one's anxieties, to be more at peace. So anyway, I think I put him through his paces so that the reader is like gripped. Is he going to be okay? Because maybe on some unconscious level, the reader is going, am I going to be okay? Our wish to be okay. So if Happy makes it through, maybe we're going to make it through. And then once I was at an artist colony, and there was this older writer there, a wonderful writer actually, and his name is Joe Caldwell, and you should find him if you can, or maybe I'm not sure if the store has any of his books. He has this recent memoir that he wrote. He's in his mid-90s, and it's something with the word bridge in the title. Absolutely beautiful memoir about his life in 50s, 60s New York, and this long, tortured romance. He was a gay man with this lover that he was separated from for 20 or 30 years, and then met again when the man was dying of AIDS. And a very beautiful book. And so I highly recommend it. It made me cry twice, which is unusual, reading a book or to even cry. But anyway, Joe Caldwell. So anyway, at this artist colony, Yaddo, if those of you might know this beautiful artist colony in Saratoga Springs, New York, Joe was holding forth at breakfast one morning, giving advice to younger writers. And he was quoting something, I think, from some famous 1930s movie, which was like writing advice, which was, when in doubt, torture the heroine, torture the heroine. For some reason, it was like in Blaue Angel, the Blue Angel, some like writing professor. I don't know if this is true in the Marlene Dietrich film. Maybe he's giving advice to a playwright saying, if your play is having a slow moment in a German accent, torture the heroine, torture the heroine. So I used to teach writing. And so I would tell my students, torture the heroine or the hero. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't have to be just the heroine. You could torture, you know what I mean? Let's make it gender inclusive or whatever. So I would always tell my writing students, torture the hero, torture the heroine. So I think without thinking about it, I torture my hero as a way to keep the reader interested.
Absolutely. Speaking of ways to dig into character, there's a classic noir trope I think you really mastered in this book. My example is there's a long drive down the coast throughout the book from Washington back down to Los Angeles that reminds me the contemplative drives. One day I'll pronounce it correctly. The thoughtful drives in Crumley's The Last Good Kiss, where the trope being that between the chapters of action and interrogation, the detective's by himself reflecting, and you do two things with it. It's the classic slow Joe in the back row moment. Let's catch everybody up. Here's what's happened, right? But at the same time, you get a peek into Happy's mind working, a peek into his voice and really inside. I think of it almost as those classic noir voiceover moments, right? So how did you get into Happy's head to write those scenes?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. In the first book, Happy's on a stakeout for a little while, and that was a really good spot to throw in like a quick summary, like, okay, so this is happening, like he's trying to figure it all out, but it's also for the reader to like sum up everything that's happened to that moment. So it was in a stakeout. And then I guess in the ride, you might be more fresh in your mind. He does a little bit of that where he's trying to pull it all together of who's doing what. And I didn't put in these long driving sequences because of Crumley's book. Though I had read that book. It's a great book. I haven't read it for a while. But the fact that you mentioned that, I'm wondering if the person I kind of picked up the long drive from was Ross MacDonald. Those of you who read the Lou Archer stories, a lot of times in the Lou Archer detective novels, Lou Archer's like driving 3 hours here, he's driving to Vegas, then he's coming back to LA, then he's going up the coast to Santa Barbara. Like he's often driving, like pursuing. And then the same thing in the Parker books. A lot of times Parker might be driving up and down the East Coast looking for another criminal he's got to take out. So I often liked that weird diligence of the detective, of almost like me. I guess in my own mind, I thought, should I have Happy come to the Midwest? Like, is there some way to use this 4-hour drive from, like Minneapolis to Milwaukee, because it's fun to be in different environments. In this book, he goes up to Olympia, Washington. I'm like, is there a reason to bring him here? Could there be something cool? And then I'm like looking at this beautiful old architecture, I don't. So anyway, but for me, it was more like the rides was more of an homage to the Ross MacDonald And Ross McDonald was very much the heir apparent to Chandler. And so I think that's why I did those long drives to, again, for me, I'm very steeped in these detective tropes. One of them that I wrote about, not in the book, but I think it's a website called, I think it's called Novel Suspects. Sometimes the publisher asks you to try to write for blogs as a way to promote your book. And so I wrote this piece, and it's up there somewhere, I think Novel Suspects. And one of the things I had noticed early on in my writing career, those of you who are fans of Raymond Chandler, is that Marlowe is always getting hit on the back of his head and doing these beautiful, elaborate descriptions of losing consciousness. And they're almost like premonitions, or, to quote the Williams Wordsworth, intimations of mortality. And so that was a trope that I always noticed. And oftentimes Chandler, and then I saw Ross McDonald would do it. He would save his most poetic writing for the knockout blow. So I have this piece on the web right now called The Knockout Blow. So again, you were just bringing up the tropes of the long ride. There's also the trope of getting hit in the back of the head, the detective losing consciousness, and then either in the first person, in the case of Marlowe and myself, describing this loss of consciousness. So I've had a lot of fun, having Happy get knocked out and then coming up with elaborate descriptions of, falling into darkness, or a sheet of, seeing a Ferris wheel of blood, or, what I mean? These kinds of grotesque noir things right before. And in this essay, I say that maybe this was Raymond Chandler trying to imagine the last moments before dying. Anyway, so if you find that, I was happy with this little quick promo piece I had to write. So anyway, I'm touting myself.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tout the book too, because I think you nailed a couple of those knockouts. One of the things I always love about those, and so much noir, is it's always a surprise. It's always, this fight's going really well. Oh, I'm really on top of things. Oops. And there's a couple moments I think you did that very well. Not to give them away, but you'll have fun.
Thank you. My mom read the book, which is great. And I think she texted me, she did text me, and she said, "Oh my God, that fight scene by the bridge." I'm not giving anything away. And my mom was, pretty genteel. She's a poet. But I don't know, something that she appreciated, like, I try to choreograph these fight scenes so that hopefully they're not too disturbing, let's say, or they are, but I don't know, there's some kind of remove, and maybe it's not as visceral as watching a violent film. But anyway, she appreciated I think the writing of the fight scene. So I was happy about that.
It's always a nice approval.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of the drives, there's you spend a lot of time describing cars in the books. Are you a car guy, or?
I'm not much of a car guy. But yeah, well, I had a fascination with the Chevy Caprice Classic and the Pontiac Parisienne. They're the same sort of model. The Pontiac Parisienne, I think, was manufactured in Canada. And my father was a traveling salesman. He wouldn't hurt him for me to say he was a little bit of a Willy Loman type, but and I don't even know if you have traveling salesmen quite in the same way anymore. But towards the end of his career, he always had the company car as a salesman. And then sometimes I guess he would buy them back from the company, and then I would inherit them. And he liked these great big cars. He sold textile chemicals, the kind of stuff that you might put on a rain slicker or something, fire retardants. This was the stuff he was selling in the 60s and 70s and into the mid 80s. And so I inherited two of these great big tanks, and I always loved them. And so I don't know, they have a special place for me, these particular, the Pontiac Parisienne and the Chevrolet Caprice Classic. I don't know why.
No, they're great big whales of cars. I love that. And speaking to traveling salesmen, there's a piece in a New Yorker in the last month or so about a group of traveling salesmen that are working now, and it's still very active, but it's mostly shifted to selling you solar panels for your home, knocking on your door to sell you solar panels. So,
Yeah. My dad wasn't like a door to door. He just went to these probably these old industrial towns that probably don't even have factories anymore, but he would just drive up and down the East Coast calling on these clients, and then sometimes even going all the way up to Canada, where they called him Le Grand Cigar because he always had a cigar in his mouth. And
I want to talk some about, I definitely want to ask you some about both of the locations in the book. First of all, let's start with LA, which you've lived there, you told me, for 8 years now. And although you're a native New Yorker, so that begs the question, do you like LA?
I do like Los Angeles. I moved there 8 years ago for work and didn't know that I would end up staying. But after, I guess, like 3 decades of my adulthood being in tiny apartments in New York, I was like, whoa, I'm in a house. And I was renting a house, and it wasn't a fancy house, but it actually had a little bit of a swimming pool. So I really did feel like a Beverly Hills Billy, like, oh my God, I have a pool. I loved it, even though it was all cracking. And I just loved being in a house. And then LA, I don't know how familiar some of you are or not, but one of the things about LA that people don't talk about, there's incredible flowers everywhere year round, and incredible smell of flowers year round. Like, I would come back late at night to my house from my job, and my house would smell like a floral shop from like the jasmine at night. And so I fell in love with that aspect of Los Angeles, living in a home, some of the physical beauty, though there's a lot of physical ugliness to LA, the way it's sort of spread out. But then, like, you get off these flat main things that are filled with little strip malls and into the hills or the neighborhoods, that there is a lot of beauty. You also have the desert, which I write about in the book. I've come to spend a fair amount of time out in the desert. In the colder months, it's really beautiful out there. And then you have the ocean. So there's this, and then you have like mountains ringing it. And in the colder months, you see snow on the mountains. And then during the pandemic, when the smog really lifted, you're like, you really saw the mountains. So anyway, all this to say that I do very much like LA. All the years I was in New York, when I would visit LA, like, New York can have almost a cultish impact on your mind, where you think, how can anyone live anywhere else? Like, you really like, and maybe it's a way to endure how difficult it is to live there. Like, you get brainwashed or something. And then, like, I broke free of that. I'm like, I don't want to live there anymore. So I don't know. It's interesting because I was born in New York, but raised outside the city. Like, my grandparents were in Brooklyn and all that. But anyway, yeah, I do like LA, but New York's still an incredible city.
Absolutely. And one more LA question, because we're sitting here talking about Chandler and Ross McDonald and all these classic West Coast LA writers. LA is always changing, and I think you can say that about any city, and it's easy to go to any city and say, oh, that changed. But let's go the other way. What does not change in LA? Or what do you think is the constants in that city that make it such a great town for writing noir and writing crime?
Yeah, well, first of all, I live in what I consider Chandler country, because I'm in the Hollywood Hills, and I'm literally beneath the Hollywood sign, the neighborhood I live in, which is called Beechwood Canyon, and there's this main drag there called Franklin Avenue. And if you read Chandler short stories or novels, everything like is branching off of Franklin, then down to Hollywood Boulevard and Sunset Boulevard. And so I'm like, and there's these old hotels around there and these old apartment buildings that he names in a lot of the short stories and novels. And it's all right where I currently live. And so I love being around, like, seeing the glimpses of what he was writing about in the 30s and 40s and then into the 50s. And in fact, those of you who are deep into your Chandler stuff, you know that he wrote these short stories in the 30s probably mid-30s. He started writing quite late in life. His first novel was published when he was 51, The Big Sleep. And he had been, an oil executive. I guess the Depression, he lost his job, started writing short stories for the pulp magazines. And so then I think all of his novels, except the last one, he took these short stories that he'd written for the pulp magazines that were very popular at the time, and he cannibalized them and smushed them together to make his novels. And he would rewrite a lot of passages. So for those of you who are fans of Farewell, My Lovely, that's like a combination of 2 or 3 of these short stories from the 30s, one of which was called, I think, Try the Girl. And in Try the Girl is this house described a little bit against a hillside with a porch, where in Farewell, My Lovely, this bad guy, good guy called Moose Malloy, in Try the Girl, he's got a different name, I forget what it is, climbs like this balcony. I drive past that house couple of times a week, the very house that Chandler described in Try the Girl. Now, that house didn't make it into Farewell, My Lovely, but I'm just saying, for me, as like someone who reads Chandler, like, I don't know, the way some people, I don't know, I'm a huge fan. And so it's like I'm obsessed with all these locations. So I get to live where he did all this writing. Now, I'm being a little long-winded as to why LA is good for noir writing. I don't know that necessarily it is. I just think that Chandler planted such a poetic flag there. And, and Chandler very much took a torch from Dashiell Hammett. Dashiell Hammett wrote about San Francisco primarily with his Continental Op private detective stories. But I think Chandler just made LA this place that it was like Lemmings, so every writer wants to go there and try to write about it the way Chandler did or something. Like, I don't think necessarily that LA is more noirish than any other place, but there is beautiful light there, which he would write about. There is this weird mix of wealth and great wealth, maybe, which lends itself to decadence and violence or something. And then the other thing is having a lot of locations, which I think Ross McDonald took more advantage of the desert, the ocean. Anyway, so that could be some of it, but I mostly think it's because Chandler planted this flag there, and everyone wants to go there like going to the Arctic, the way, following some explorer.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's hard to talk about the city and books without talking about them. Absolutely. I've got a couple more questions, and then I do want to let y'all get a couple questions in if we can. So quickly, the other location, Spokane, Washington. What drew you there? Why'd you want to write about Spokane?
Not to correct you, it's Olympia.
It is Olympia, and I even have that written down here. I just can't.
I like the fact that you said Spokane, which is Enacops backwards, because when I think in the 3rd or 4th grade, I think I did one of my very first reports on Spokane, Washington, because I think they had the World's Fair in the 70s or something. I don't know if anyone could check that, but I remember doing like this, like, back then you had that kind of paper where you could do tracing or something. And I think I traced like the map of Spokane in the 3rd or 4th grade. So anyway, I've never been there, but you just saying that word Spokane, I had a deep, because it was one of my first school things. Anyway,
that was my intention.
Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, back to the capital of Washington.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I made it Olympia, and I've never actually been to Olympia. But I wanted it in the Pacific Northwest for personal reasons. And at the same time, I wanted to not have it be too personal to a northern city. So I wanted to find another one, and I chose Olympia. And to describe Olympia, I did the modern thing of looking at pictures on the internet and studying some maps of it. So I got the streets right. And so I've never actually been to Olympia, but I studied the photos and looked at the weather for the time of year when the character is there. I was aware, and just looking at the pictures, I think it's Mount Rainier, or that overlooks the whole city, and which maybe I think it's I don't know if it's, in Portland, maybe there's a mountain that overlooks the city and you see the snow. So I could have that I had been to Portland, but so anyway, that I've never been there, but I used the internet to help me describe it.
Excellent. And then my last question, and this will be my writing workshop question. You've had a prolific career, varied career, but these books are a little different because you said you finally made that decision to write the noir series. I'm going to write crime fiction in this series, and you're doing a book a year. And so how has writing this diving into this changed the process of writing that, or even how has just writing a book a year changed it for you?
Yeah. Well, yeah, let me think. So the thing is, I began as I don't know, literary fiction. I didn't necessarily think in terms of genre. I don't know that I necessarily still think in terms of genre. I'm writing books, but I know that these things are called crime novels or mysteries or thrillers. I do know that I, at a certain point, really wanted to try to write page turners. Now, earlier in my career, and when I was a writing teacher, one of the things I would tell my students, it was my take on the Hemingway maxim. Hemingway supposedly said, write what you know. And I would tell my students, write what you love. So if there's a certain kind of book that you love reading, write that kind of book. Or if there's an author you love, like mimic them, channel them. And because you love that, that's what you're studying, that's what you're apprenticing in, and that love for that form will come through because it gives you joy. And so for example, like my second novel, well, actually all my books were inspired by kinds of books that I liked reading. My first novel was very dark and short, but I was inspired by the time by the prose of Raymond Carver, but also the subject matter of Hubert Selby, a bit of Hemingway. I broke it up into short chapters the way Hemingway did his first book of short stories with these italicized sections. Then my second book, I was like sort of fascinated by Thomas Mann and The Magic Mountain and Evelyn Waugh and books I thought of as like novels about young gentlemen, Somerset Maugham. So I wrote, and also A Confederacy of Dunces and Don Quixote. So all those things got channeled into that book. And then the third book was like, I had become obsessed with P.G. Wodehouse, and I really wanted to write something like Jeeves and Wooster. And so I literally wrote a book about a guy who reads too much Wodehouse and loses his mind. And kind of like Don Quixote read too many books of chivalry and thought he was a knight. And then I'm going through my whole career, but then at a certain point, to survive, besides being an adjunct professor, I got the lucky break and ended up in television, and just sort of miraculously. And so my TV show was all about a writer who reads too many detective novels and thinks he can be a detective. So again, I was playing on this thing of books driving you crazy. And I mean, this is like heaven, you know, and those of you who have read A Dance to the Music of Time by Anthony Pohl, he has a book titled Books Do Furnish a Room. And just like if you have a room just with a lot of books, you don't need a lot of fancy furniture. You know what I mean? It can kind of distract the eye. Anyway, but then, so at a certain point, all my life, I'd been reading detective novels, yet at the same time, I was mostly a comedic writer. And then when my TV show got canceled, someone wanted me to write something for like an internet concern that you could have a pretty good word count, and they were going to pay something half decent. I forget what it was called, Byliner. I don't think it exists anymore, but a friend of mine was an editor there, and she said she could get me $10,000 to write like a long short story, maybe 15 to 20,000 words. I'm like, that sounds good. I'll do it. And this will be a chance for me to write a thriller, you know, because it's like, it's for the internet. It's not a whole book, but I've been obsessed with the form. Let me try it myself. And also, I just spent 3 years writing a TV show where the constant pressure I was getting from the people above was make it funnier, make it funnier, make it funnier. It's which is almost like saying, be taller, be taller. I'm being as funny as I can be, believe me. And so anyway, so okay, I was free of that. And I'm like, I'm going to write a thriller. I was very inspired, as I mentioned, by Richard Stark, the Donald Westlake pseudonym, these Parker novels. So I wrote like a totally hard-boiled thriller for this internet thing, and it was called You Were Never Really Here. And it was like real liberating to finally get to write in this form that I wanted to. But then I got involved with TV again for a few years, and which caused me to move to LA, and then finally got canceled again, TV wise, knock on wood. And then finally, and sort of was struggling to write for maybe a few years. And though I did an expansion of You Were Never Really Here when the movie version came out, and then the paperback was going to be published of it, as opposed to this original internet version. And then I was kind of getting a little bit broke, hadn't written anything for a few years. I'm like, I've got to write my detective novel. And enough things had shifted inside me, like, you know how we hear about the ice breaking off or something, not in a good way, but some things had chipped away inside me where I suddenly was free to try to write this detective novel. And that's actually an interesting story. And I just did this thing of, if you write 2 pages a day, you know, in 6 months, you could actually have a short, fast novel done if you do 2 pages a day. And I wrote the first book in about 4 to 5 months, doing 2 pages a day, rigorous, like someone training for a marathon. And then the editing process, this and that. And then as soon as A Man Named Doll was done, I more or less started The Wheel of Doll. And again, took about, you know, maybe 6 months, and then between the editing. So they take about a year from like when you start editing, copy editing, this and that. And now I've started the 3rd doll book, though I have to do some script work to, you know, pay the bills or something. But yeah, I hope to get back into the book, and just that thing of like 2 pages a day or 1 page a day, but just sitting down every day, and just trying to push the story forward just a little bit.
Absolutely. I think we're all excited for the next doll book. And we're all excited for this one. We're running pretty short on time, but we've got time. I do want to throw it out for at least a couple audience questions, if who's got one. Yes.
How long does it take you to write?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, you need to do that thing, you repeat the question. I think you could all hear. How long does it take you to write 2 pages? Well, that's a good question. For those of you who are writers in the audience or not, like, I know people always love to hear about process. And so my process is, the mornings are sort of for life and anything I have to do. And then I have like a lunch or late breakfast, then I take a nap, and with my dog, but only for about 20 minutes. I'm like, it's like a Mediterranean life. And then I start the day over, I drink some coffee, and hopefully I'm at my desk by 2 o'clock. And then maybe I'm there till 7 or 8. And then what I do is, I sometimes, like right now, I'm at the beginning of this new doll book. I only have about 20 pages done. I'll go start on page 1, kind of comb through, editing, cleaning up. Maybe I'll expand a section or delete a section, then hopefully get to page 20, and then push forward like by a page or 2, you know, which is scary, creating the new stuff. But then you sort of pick up momentum, you get back into the dream of your own stuff. So in a sense, it might take me 5 hours to write those 2 pages, but maybe I write those in the last 45 minutes of that, because I've done this editing, I'm ruminating, I'm playing spelling bee on the New York Times. You know, I don't know, those of you who do spelling bee at nytimes.com, I love it. And you know, it's more fun than Wordle. I don't know. Are there other spelling bee people out there? Oh, it's a really fun thing on, if you go to the New York Times, it's like a word game. It's kind of like Boggle, which is Elgagob backwards. And so anyway, yeah, so in some ways, like 4-5 hours to get to those 2 pages. Now, sometimes maybe I don't have that many hours, but that's how I've tried to construct my life, so that I have the whole afternoon into the evening free to try to make books.
And it's only a day. And then what was scary to write is the old stuff that you're combing through again.
What's that?
And then only a day goes by and the scary stuff to write it's just the old stuff again that you're combing through.
Yeah, and you've pushed forward, and the editing is kind of nice, and then and sometimes maybe that page occurs in the rewriting, like, okay, I expanded something, but if I can just try to get it forward a page or two a day, then yeah, in 6 months. And for these books, my goal is, well, there's the word count. As soon as I'm over 60,000 words, I know it's enough to make, a nice, basically sized book, not too slender, but, enough for a reader. And the Richard Stark books that I mentioned, they're all, at least the early ones that he wrote in the 60s and 70s, though some of them, they did get longer, were about this length. And so once I hit 60,000 words, I know that would be enough for the publisher, or a little over 200 pages. So that's my goal for trying to create this like quick page turner and move on.
So one more quick one and then we'll sign some books.
No, yeah, because at a certain point, you're like, okay, I've gone over that enough. And if you go over it too much, then you might begin hitting perfectionism, or just rewriting yourself too much, and you just kill it, for yourself. And you just, which can be the biggest thing, whether you're a writer or not. We all have to deal with, most of us have to deal with perfectionism, and it really can not be a good thing. And so yeah, at a certain point, like right now, I'm very close to, okay, you don't need to reread those first 10 pages anymore. Start on page 10. You know what happens, but it's not like I might want to start at the beginning because like don't want to push forward, but you know what I mean? So it's like it's easier just to reread that stuff, like, oh, that's pretty good, and I'm getting into my own, what's it, doing your own supply or whatever, what that phrase is. But yeah, so pretty soon now, like I'm on page 22 of this new manuscript. I should start really on page 10 now, or page 15, revise those 7 pages, move forward. Then at a certain point, like for example, right now, I've not been able to write for a week or 2 weeks. I'll have to go back to the beginning to sort of fall back into the dream of my own thing. And for me, I just want to say, for those of you who are writers, it's like, especially during this time of COVID and everything, like writing is such a solace. I feel so lucky or grateful that I get to sit down and play with sentences and try to, I don't know, convey my sense of fascination for the world and its beauty, and also my heartbreak that I have this outlet, and with the hope of sharing it with other people to either give them some distraction or entertainment or make them feel less alone. But for me, I just really have come, especially as I've gotten older, just really so happy to be sitting at my desk playing with sentences and makes and sort of forgetting about the world for a little while. So I really cherish those times.
I can't think of a better place to end than that.
Well, I could think of one place,
but Jonathan can.
No, but this is just me being controlling, which is Gni Lort Knock backwards. It's just a shtick I do, but and I probably did on the virtual thing, but
Yes, please.
In New York, I used to perform a lot, give a lot of readings, and I always ended my readings with this sound that my friends and I would make on the playground when being attacked by more normal children. And it's known as the Harry call, H-A-R-I-Y, not Harry or herring. I'm sort of sometimes associated with the word herring, but it's Harry because in the 70s, when you went Harry, it meant you were going crazy. So when my friends and I were going crazy, we called it the Harry call, but it was often a cry for help, and it's quite loud. And then just to name drop it or make it funny, one of the good things that or not funny, but name drop, I guess, but that happened in my writing career, and I'll stand up to do it, was that in the early 2000s, David Letterman, through luck, discovered my books. This person who was his talent booker, who used to come see me I used to do storytelling. She would come to my shows, this woman in the early 90s, and then a decade later, she became David Letterman's talent booker. And when I would do these shows in the early 90s, I was like, why aren't I getting discovered? And I wasn't, but it did pay off 10 years later. You never know what's going to happen in life. So anyway, she got me on Letterman, and he would have me on at the end of the evening, and like as an eccentric, and he would have David Sedaris and me and a couple other nutty types. And he was told about this sound, so he would have me do it, and I got to be on Letterman like 3 times, and which led me to having it anyway. But so I would always do the Harry call. So anyway, I'll do 3 Harry calls. 3 directions. The idea, it's like almost like I'm a broken weather vane. I'm missing a 4th direction, so I only have 3. And I don't know how good they'll be because I don't have any water, but here are 3 Harry calls.
Jonathan, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you. I have copies of both The Wheel of Doll and A Man Named Doll, which just came out in paperback at our front desk for sale. That's the front flat surface at the front of the store. My colleagues behind there will sell you a book, and Jonathan's going to be up this way. We've just got a few minutes left to sign them, so please come get your signed. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chris, for all your very thoughtful questions.
Thank you.